In 2021, a film called Belfast was released. Directed by Kenneth Branagh, Belfast follows the life of a 9-year-old boy named Buddy as he and his family struggle to survive during the Troubles, a sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland that occurred during the mid to late 20th century. Now, when I first read about this movie, I wondered to myself, what are the Troubles? The term, the Troubles, sounded sinister, ominous even. What flashed in my mind was images I associate with 1980s dark fantasy movies. You know, something that is undoubtedly interesting and mysterious, but leaves you feeling uncomfortable because of how foreboding it is. Like the nothing from The Never-Ending Story. So I wanted to learn some more. I learned about a conflict in Ireland that lasted for almost 30 years and the brutality that people suffered under when this happened. And the scenes in the film that depict the conflict were very upsetting to look at. It was so much chaos. The actual images and videos I saw of the conflict were even more difficult for me to watch. After learning about the Troubles, I can't imagine how difficult living through this would have been. And understanding the real events that inspired the film gave me a deeper appreciation for how impactful those scenes were for me. So today, we're going to talk about the story behind Belfast. The Troubles was a factional conflict in Northern Ireland that lasted from 1968 to 1998. The conflict was between Protestant Unionists, aka the Loyalists, who wanted the region to remain part of the United Kingdom, and Roman Catholic Nationalists, aka the Republicans, who wanted Northern Ireland to become part of the Republic of Ireland. But to understand how Ireland ended up in this conflict, one must go back to the 1100s. The origin of the social and political tensions that caused the Troubles goes all the way back to the 12th century, when the British began to raid the island nation to assist the King of Leinster, an event remembered as the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland. For the next 800 years, England and later Great Britain took control over Ireland's affairs, with British landlords colonizing the area and displacing many Irish landholders. Ulster, a province in the northern region of the island, became a center for rebellion among tenants. Ulster would become the place where much of the struggle for Irish emancipation would unfold. Also, Ireland's majority Catholic population was contending with the religious prejudice that came with living under the supremacy of Protestant religion in their country, as the settlers who were now running things were Protestants from lowland Scotland and the north of England. Not only that, but Protestants and Catholics themselves have a long history of being really mean to each other. This contempt they have for one another started in the 1500s, when Christians who didn't like certain corrupt practices within the Catholic tradition separated from the Church and named themselves the Protestants, initiating the Reformation. In response, the Catholic Church would execute Protestants as a way of punishing them for their disobedience, and to instill fear in the general populace in an attempt to stop people from rebelling against their political and social authority. In response to this, the Protestants would exact revenge by gaining their own political and social authority and executing Catholics, and on it went. A never-ending tit-for-tat, if you will. Of course, they're not executing each other today, and when they're around each other, one can definitely see that they have learned to be cordial toward one another, but find them speaking with fellow members of their respective groups, and it's very clear that they both still harbor some negative feelings regarding their past conflicts. By the 17th century, the population in the province of Ulster was such that Protestant colonists outnumbered the indigenous Irish of the region, and the current generation of English and Scottish settlers were less interested in assimilating to the native Irish culture as earlier settlers were. Instead, they were unshakingly loyal to the British Crown. Eventually, the exploitation of the indigenous Irish people and their land became common practice among the settlers. The situation got so bad that it became a subject of conversation in England, a conversation that elicited disappointment regarding how the Irish were being treated. One of these opinions came in the form of a pamphlet published in 1729 by celebrated Anglo-Irish author Jonathan Swift, titled A Modest Proposal. Already famous for his works, such as his renowned novel Gulliver's Travels, Swift utilized satire as he cut into England for its legal and economic exploitation of Ireland and the suffering that it had caused to the indigenous people. To add insult to injury, the 1845 Irish potato famine, which occurred over 100 years later, and the failure of the government to respond to the suffering of the Irish who had been starving, added to an ever-growing list of grievances that sparked both rebellion among the population and calls for Irish independence. In the early 20th century, 4 of the 9 modern counties that constituted the province of Ulster had a Protestant loyalist majority. During the First World War, Republicans seized notable buildings in Dublin and proclaimed an Irish Republic in what is remembered as the Easter Uprising. The British Army fought the rebels, and the insurrection was stopped within a week. Sadly, within that time, over 2,000 civilians had been injured or had lost their lives. In 1919, the Irish War for Independence began, and in 1920, the British Parliament, responding mostly to the desires of Ulster loyalists, divided Ireland into 2 self-governing areas. The war ended in 1921 with the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which created the Irish Free State in the south, which would act as an autonomous community within the British Empire, and Northern Ireland, which was allowed to remain separate from the south to act as a self-governing region of the United Kingdom. In 1949, the Irish Free State became a republic. Northern Ireland was majority Protestant. The best jobs in the region, as well as the values being most represented in government, were mostly advantageous to Protestants, while Catholics, who had larger families and faced more unemployment, were not being afforded the same societal considerations. The Catholics argued that they were experiencing discrimination when it came to the provision of public housing, appointment to public service jobs, and the government's investment in their neighborhoods. They were also commonly subjected to cruelty by the police. The cultural and political divide between the Catholics and Protestants of Northern Ireland caused more and more strain as time went on. The Catholics mostly identified as Irish and wanted Northern Ireland to be incorporated into the Irish state, while the Protestants identified as British and feared that if Northern Ireland became part of the Irish state, they would lose both their own culture and the socio-economic privileges that they had been enjoying up to that point. Neither Irish history nor the Irish language was taught in schools, and it was illegal to fly the flag of the Irish Republic. In fact, from 1956 to 1974, political allegiance to Irish republicanism was not tolerated, and the party of Irish republicanism was banned. To offset some of the effects of various policies that disadvantaged Catholics, the Northern Ireland Parliament passed the Education Act in 1947 to increase educational opportunities for all citizens in the province. The generation of Catholic children who grew up under the Education Act came of age in the 1960s, and given the fact that they were better educated than the generations before them, finished their schooling with expectations that the Catholic community be treated fairly, not just in education, but in society in general. The 1960s, in and of itself, was a decade of activism. Political action of all sorts had been happening all around the world. The activistic culture of the 1960s was part of a period called the Era of Activism, and the civil rights movement in America, which had started back in the mid-1950s, acted as a core inspiration and initiator for the era of activism. Inspired by the civic events of the day, Catholic activists in Ireland came together to form their own civil rights groups and began organizing marches. The marches were, often, violently disrupted by those who opposed Northern Ireland's civil rights movement. There's no clear consensus on the exact date that the Troubles began. However, there are a couple of notable events that are believed to have contributed significantly to worsening the pre-existing tension between the two groups. One occurred on October 5, 1968 in Derry. A civil rights march against police brutality was planned and was blocked by a counter-demonstration. Rioting erupted, with marchers being violently suppressed with batons and a water cannon. Another notable conflict happened in August 1969 when the Apprentice Boys of Derry, a Protestant fraternal society, held their annual march. The route of the march went through the Bogside area of Derry, a region of the city that was mostly populated with Catholic families. The perspectives of the events are heavily contested between the two sides. What is understood is that there were Protestant marchers who were mistreated as they walked through the majority Catholic community, and in response, law enforcement tried to keep the residents of Bogside away from the parade, which caused 3 days of rioting. The event is remembered as the Battle of Bogside. For about the next 30 years, Northern Ireland would be plunged into an era of endless viciousness and destruction. As far as the two sides' political and social stances are concerned, the nationalists, which made up the Catholic community, wanted an independent Ireland, no longer under British control, while the Unionists, which made up the Protestant community, wanted Northern Ireland to remain linked to the United Kingdom. A nurse named Kathleen O'Hanlon, who worked at Belfast's Royal Victoria Hospital from 1958 to 1988, shared that throughout her career, she noticed that Catholics did not get promotions, even when they proved to be more qualified, and that access to housing was also limited for Catholic families, as Protestants would be given preferential treatment in certain instances. She shared that it was issues like these that gave rise to the civil rights movement. It wasn't long before the British Army was brought in to restore order. The British Army's presence, though meant to help maintain peace, only escalated elements of the conflict. Terence Friend, a British Army NCO who served in Northern Ireland in 1970, talked about his experience seeing the destruction that the Troubles had caused, as well as the aggression that he and his fellow officers experienced. When asked about his experience interacting with civilians, Friend said, "The ones that were friendly were very friendly, but the ones that weren't were the exact opposite. You got stoned and bottled and petrol bombed and all the rest of it in a Protestant area, just as much as you did in the Catholic one." There were other organizations present for the conflict, like the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the Ulster Defence Regiment. Between the 1960s and early 1970s, unofficial military groups called paramilitary organizations were established on both the Republican and Loyalist sides, and there was a concerning rise in membership in both. The resulting attacks and bombings by these paramilitary groups got so bad that the British Army resorted to building walls between the two communities to keep them separated in hopes of stopping them from attacking each other. Years of continued bombings and assassinations committed by both the Republicans and Loyalists followed. In 1992, the Royal Irish Regiment played a peacekeeping role as well. In 1997, the two sides called for a ceasefire. There were some on the Republican movement who were against the ceasefire and split off into their own army to continue bombings. The official end of the Troubles would come in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement, which created a plan that outlined the future relationship between Ireland and Britain. Unfortunately, 4 months after the Good Friday Agreement, a group of the Republicans who had opposed the 1997 ceasefire took 29 lives and injured several hundred people with a car bomb in Omagh. By the time the Troubles came to an end, 3,600 people had lost their lives, and more than 30,000 others had been wounded. As I read about the conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants, I thought of how both the denominations are adamant that they operate with unchanging benevolence, but that does come into question when you think about how they both have reacted historically to people who didn't agree with them and ideas that didn't fit into their individual interpretations of Abrahamic philosophy. For example, the Roman Catholic Inquisition was responsible for thousands of brutal executions, like that of Cornelio da Montalcino, a Franciscan monk who was burned alive in 1554 for embracing Judaism. And then we have the English Reformation, which resulted in the legal persecution and executions of scores of Catholics in the 1500s. Margaret Clitheroe was one of these victims. In 1586, while pregnant with her fourth child, she was crushed to death for protecting Catholic priests from the Protestant authorities. I noticed that both movements claim to operate with reason and be in the right historically. However, in both events, sheer viciousness was used to control people through the elicitation of panic and fear of being harmed. They both have in their historical ranks innocent people who died as martyrs and guilty people who committed heinous acts against others. And as I dived into the messy history of this religious conflict between the two denominations, I came away from it really wishing people would just leave the innocent alone. Everyone is on a unique spiritual journey that's between them and God. People should be free to explore organized religion and the many forms it takes. They should be free to choose what they believe without fear of being brutalized because someone decided to be offended by their choices. If we happen to come across someone who lives or believes differently from us, I think the best first step is to learn about who they are first, approaching them with a desire to learn and understand, not blindly condemn and hold contempt for them. If you hear them out and still find that you don't agree, at least you learned something new. Lastly, learning about the Troubles made me wonder what it would have been like to be a child born after 1968 who had to grow up in and survive in this type of environment. This conflict lasted about 30 years. That means there are people who spent their entire childhoods having no memory of a time before the Troubles. For those children who remembered a time before the Troubles, it must have felt like it would never end. It was fascinating to see how Buddy navigated the realities of the brutality and prejudice he witnesses and struggles with himself. At some points, he makes bad decisions, falling to the influence of the chaos around him. And I know Buddy's a fictional character, but I would like to hope that he was able to rise above the horrible things he saw and grew up to be a decent person. So, have you seen Belfast? And what are your views about the religious and social conflicts of the Troubles? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.